Welcome to ICU Primary Prepcast. And this is a fun episode because we got a couple of guests on this podcast now, which are not new to you. Basically, Maddie has come back from her sabbatical. And as usual, we are joined by a new celebrity of the podcast world, Dr. Mike Clifford from Melbourne. So welcome, Mike and Maddie.
Hello, Swapnil. Hello, Maddie.
Hello. Good to be back.
So first of all, Maddie, congratulations for passing your exams and welcome to the fellowship world.
Thank you. It's a big relief.
And it's a big relief for Mike as well, because he doesn't need to worry about creating his dad jokes anymore because you're back now.
That's right.
Yeah.
The mantle of responsibility is now lifted from my shoulders.
Well, I heard you did very well, Mike.
Oh, you didn't see the Twitter sphere. It was going crazy trying to get rid of me. Don't you worry.
So obviously it's great to have you both back, because when two intelligent people are in the room, a person like me can just stand behind and just watch you guys have a go at each other. So we're going to continue the same pattern that we did in our last episode. And thanks to Mike for suggesting that format. I called it as a modified Pomodoro technique. Now, those who don't know, the Pomodoro technique is basically you try to do things in chunk. So basically, when you're at ward round, you got 25 minutes at bedside and you can smash 3 questions with one of your colleagues. So we are going to carry the same format where we are going to take the clinical scenario and walk you through 3 different questions that you can practice at the bedside. So we are going to continue with the same patient that we discussed last time, a 42-year-old male patient who is admitted to intensive care unit with diagnosis of pneumonia and septic shock. And Mike, you are the consultant on, and Maddie, you are the registrar on. So Mike, over to you.
I think Maddie's now the senior fellow on. So she's got her exam. So we expect even more from her.
Oh, no.
Having said that, Maddie, we're looking at this patient. You can see that his saturations are 96% on the monitor. I'm just wondering if you could tell me, what does that mean? What does that 96% mean?
So the oxygen saturation is a measure of how much hemoglobin is bound to oxygen compared to how much hemoglobin remains unbound. So in this case, it's 96% is oxygenated.
Okay, and how do we get that number? How does that number appear on the monitor?
Okay, so this uses pulse oximetry, and there are several important principles useful in pulse oximetry to consider. So the first principle is the principle of light absorbance as described by the Beer-Lambert law. So this law states that the measured absorbance for a single compound is directly proportional to the concentration of that compound and the length of the light path. So in this case, the amount of light absorbed is proportional to the amount of hemoglobin present and the width of the artery that the light is travelling through. The second principle that's used is that oxyhemoglobin and deoxyhemoglobin absorb light at different wavelengths in different amounts. So deoxyhemoglobin absorbs more of red light, which has a wavelength of about 60 nanometers, whereas oxyhemoglobin absorbs more infrared light, and this has a wavelength of around 940. Therefore, the amount of red and infrared light absorbed by the blood will depend on the proportion of deoxy and oxyhemoglobin present.
So if we look at the pulse oximeter on this bloke's finger, it seems to be a red light flashing. What's actually going on in the apparatus?
Okay, so the oximeter itself consists of a probe which that minimises the ambient light and contains these light-emitting diodes that emit rapid sequences of red light at the 660 and infrared at 940. And the other principle that is used is that the pulse oximeter measures only pulsatile blood. So in the finger that the probe is usually on, light can also be absorbed by other tissues such as skin, which would otherwise confound the measurement of oxygen saturation. However, because the pulse oximeter compares the pulsatile signals, that is those that have changing absorbance levels over time, with signals that are non-pulsatile, such as skin and venous blood, a ratio is created of the pulsatile to the non-pulsatile elements at the 2 different wavelengths measured. And then this is measured by a photodetector on the other side of the probe, which records the amount of light received and can compare it to the amount of light received when the red light is on, when the infrared light is on, and when neither is on.
What does it have a neither light on for? Why is the off phase?
So the off phase is so that it can compare with the tissues that are not pulsatile. So when the arterial blood is not pulsatile, so things like skin and venous blood.
Okay. You mentioned Beer-Lambert's law. Which law is operative there when you're looking at light going through skin and being absorbed? What's varying?
Oh, I don't know.
Well, okay. You mentioned that there's ratios detected. Do you know what that ratio is called? What the modulation ratio is?
So I know that it's an R value, but it's a graph of empirical values derived from measuring oxygen saturations of healthy volunteers. And they were asked to breathe lower and lower concentrations of oxygen. And then measurements were made of the PaO2 and the oxygen saturation, and they created a calibration graph. But they only allowed the volunteers to desaturate to up to 75%. So the rest of the calibration was calculated empirically. So that's why it can be inaccurate, or there's less accuracy at saturations less than 75%.
Yeah, that's very good. So in this, Blake, what other things could make the pulse oximeter inaccurate?
So there are several things that limit pulse oximetry. There's difficulties in signal measurement. So this could be if the patient was severely agitated, moving, had seizures. If this patient was also very shocked and had poor peripheral perfusion, so if they were hypovolemic or hypothermic, or excessive vasoconstrictors. Things like non-pulsatile flow, such as if the patient was on bypass, or if they had arrhythmias or venous pulsations, such as severe TR. If they had severe anemia or abnormal pigmentation, or in some of other patients, if they have nail polish on. Then there are other issues that can happen with pulse oximetry, including interference with absorbents, such as dyshemoglobinemias, such as carboxyhemoglobin or methemoglobinemia, or the presence of dyes, such as methylene blue. And then the other issue is errors in calibration, like I've already touched base on. So if the patient had very low oxygen saturations to begin with.
Yeah, that's very good. So if you've got, well, I work in a unit where we have single ventricle babies and they're often very blue. So what happens to the pulse oximeter accuracy once you go below 75%?
It's less accurate.
Yeah, it sure is. Okay. And so what would we have to do to confirm what the number's telling us in that setting?
So I guess one of the important things about pulse oximetry is the technique itself is a limitation. So it's only one component of the determinant of oxygen delivery. So to confirm it, we might do an arterial blood gas and look at the PaO2. And also look at some of the other components of oxygen delivery, like looking at their other measures of cardiac output and their hemoglobin levels and markers of end organ perfusion.
That's excellent, Maddie. Well done. So the only thing I could catch you on was the Beer-Lambert law. So the finger actually expands and contracts because there's pulse going into it. So the thing that's varying in the signal is the path length, because the finger is actually getting a little bit bigger when the oxygenated hemoglobin goes into the tissues. The concentration remains effectively the same because arterial or venous blood, the hemoglobin doesn't change between the two all that much, but it's actually the path length that's varying, and that's what Lambert's law detects using your photovoltaic cells. So that's really good. One thing I did notice overnight is that the night consultant has started some vasopressin on top of the noradrenaline. I'm just, you might want to give him a ring and just ask him what was going through his head there, because I think it was Swapnil, so he might be able to answer some of your questions.
Oh yes, I'm looking forward to that. I will ask him that. So this patient then does become more shocked, and we're deciding about whether to start noradrenaline or vasopressin. Can you compare these two agents that are commonly used in ICU?
Yeah, that's right. So happy to take this question, Maddie. Often this question asked by the registrars at the bedside: why do we choose noradrenaline over vasopressin? And to be honest, there's no very kind of scientific answer why do we choose one or other, but it's likely to do with the pharmacology, how noradrenaline works versus how vasopressin works. So just to understand, the noradrenaline is a naturally occurring catecholamine which is synthesized from dopamine in adrenal medulla and released into bloodstream as a hormone, and is also released by the postganglionic sympathetic nervous system as a neurotransmitter. Now, it acts mainly via alpha-1 receptors, which is a G protein coupled receptor, but it also has actions on alpha-2, then beta-1 and beta-2 and beta-3 as well. So basically it acts on all adrenergic receptors, but the predominant action is vasoconstriction. And that's why it's always classified as a vasoconstrictor rather than inotropic agent. Now, vasopressin, on the other hand, is also known as antidiuretic hormone. It is also naturally occurring peptide released from posterior pituitary. So it does not come from your adrenal medulla. So the origin is different. It also acts on the G protein coupled receptors. It has got which are mainly classified into V1 and V2 receptors. which are kind of similar to alpha-1 receptors on which noradrenaline acts, because they all are G protein coupled receptors. But obviously the site of action is clearly different compared to noradrenaline. Now, the advantage of vasopressin or the V1, V2 receptors, these are more widely distributed and they're independent of adrenergic system. And vasopressin's vasoconstrictor effect is usually preserved even in the situations such as severe acidosis, unlike the catecholamine receptors, which are usually the response is blunted, especially in the situation where there is a metabolic acidosis. And vasopressin also has got some of the additional actions compared to noradrenaline, such as it has got some effects on platelet aggregation via V1 receptor, increased glycogenolysis in hepatocytes, and also it stimulates the ACTH release. The other main difference between the noradrenaline and vasopressin is vasopressin can act as an antidiuretic hormone via V2 receptor, which are located in the renal collecting tubules. And obviously that's something which can be challenging given the patient is in septic shock and not producing much urine. Now, V2 receptors also G protein coupled receptor and activates cyclic AMP, and this obviously increases the water permeability of the cell, and water is reabsorbed from the lobule. So it can lead to more retention and obviously decreases the urine output. So sometimes that can be again challenging in a patient with septic shock. In terms of the metabolism, obviously noradrenaline is metabolized by your monoamine oxidase or COMT, and the duration of action is quite short. Vasopressin being the peptide, it's usually metabolized in liver and obviously excreted by the renal. Even though the duration of action is pretty short for both of them, the main difference, they act via different pathways. Again, vasopressin is a potent vasoconstrictor and it predominantly acts on a splanchnic circulation, which again leads to diverting the intravascular volume into systemic circulation and thus helps to improve your overall blood pressure. Now, the difference is because NORAD also acts on beta-1, beta-2 receptor, it does have some inotropic effect, while vasopressin does not have any other direct effect on cardiac inotropy. And one of the mechanisms that noradrenaline improves the overall cardiac contractility is by improving the coronary perfusion. So in terms of, I guess, side effects, they both are potent vasoconstrictors, and noradrenaline can lead to, again, significant peripheral ischemia in a very high doses. And while vasopressin can lead to dizziness, features of suggestive water intoxication, and it can actually lead to myocardial infarction or hypersensitivity reaction. So they are the kind of main key differences. Why do we choose NORAD over vasopressin? It's more of a, I guess, familiarity of the medication, but also given that it acts mainly via all your alpha-1, alpha-2 and beta-1, beta-2 receptors, it has got additional benefit compared to vasopressin. And there are a couple of studies which are done in the past, 2 randomized control trial, VSST VAST trial and then VANISH trial, which did not show that clearly there is any mortality difference between vasopressin and noradrenaline. So yeah, we continue to choose NORAD over vasopressin. Mike, do you have any other answers to add in there?
One thing I'd say is that all of the catecholamines have a dose response and receptor specificity that occurs at different doses. So Myberg's been shown for a long time that very, very low dose noradrenaline is a beta agonist. And as you increase the concentration of the catecholamine, you increase your alpha effect. And we know that because in the body, at your cardiac nerve endings, you release noradrenaline, and that puts your heart rate up, and it acts as a beta stimulant and similarly increases your inotropy. And then as you keep increasing the concentration of noradrenaline in the system, you start to get your alpha-1 effect and you start to get vasoconstriction. So all of our catecholamine therapies are a dose-dependent phenomenon or a concentration phenomenon. So at lower doses, they're beta-1 active, and at higher doses, they're alpha-1 active. That's fairly consistent across the different systems. Similarly, vasopressin has the same sort of effect. At very, very, very low dose, vasopressin causes pulmonary vasodilation, which people don't talk about, but that's what it does. And like the catecholamines, as you increase the dose into the physiological range and then the pharmacological range, you start getting the more veno and then vasoconstrictive effect. And as you mentioned, Swapnil, there seems to be a subtle specificity, particularly towards the splanchnic circulation. So vasopressin can cause the splanchnic venous system to compress. That's one of the reasons why it's used in gut bleeding or in liver dysfunction. But as you said, in terms of outcome data for patients, which is not something we necessarily go into in the primary, but certainly the trials that have been done haven't shown that it's overwhelmingly better than noradrenaline. But it's sometimes added when noradrenaline isn't working as well as it once was, or if you've already given some steroids to improve your catecholamine responsivity and your back's up against the wall, or if you're in a unit that prefers to use vasopressin over norepinephrine because that's just what your unit decides to do. Again, in the absence of any good, strong evidence that one is better than another, it's not unreasonable to use an agent as long as you're familiar with its side effects. And the side effects are the same for both. There's some subtle variations in which bits of your body turn black first, but ultimately they both will support your blood pressure, which is often one of your key aims in septic shock. So this bloke here on the ventilator, whether we happen to be using noradrenaline yesterday when I started, or overnight you've changed him to vasopressin because he didn't seem to be responding as well, that's fair enough. We can work with that today.
Yeah, that's right. And I guess one of the things with noradrenaline is the titratability, and it gives a bit of wide range in terms with the infusion to titrate, while with the vasopressin, usually the way the traditionally it's used is either 2.4 units per hour or at max 4.2. And while the noradrenaline can be titrated in mics per kilogram per minute, and it gives a bit more wide range to titrate based on your arterial pressure. So Mike, now this patient starts getting hypoxic and your registrar is worried about that he will suffer the consequence of hypoxia. And your registrar wants to know what are the physiological effects of hypoxia.
Okay, well, that's a good question. And if we stand here by the bedside long enough, we'll probably see them. Although the caveat being that if we're running medications to make this patient more comfortable to tolerate being ventilated, then we're likely to see some blunting of those hypoxemic responses. So it gets back to, how is hypoxia sent, and then what are the effectors that respond to that? And, breathing is one of those very basic core components of life. And we've evolved to have fairly narrow controls over those variables, largely O2 and CO2. And we have peripheral and central chemoreceptors that are continuously monitoring the bloodstream and affecting changes in minute ventilation. Now, we don't tend to have to deal with hypoxia unless we fall into a pool or we run up a mountain or we exercise extremely. So most of our moment-to-moment variation in ventilation is a function of our CO2 concentration. But we do have very potent peripheral chemoreceptor responses to hypoxemia. And they're not centrally located. They're actually peripherally located in the carotid sinus and the carotid body. And the carotid body is a very, very interesting organelle that has an extremely high blood supply, so that the arterial and venous PO2 is almost identical. There's very, very little oxygen extraction. There's two subtypes of cell, and the cell that we think is the sensor cell is the glomus cell, which is very, very richly innervated and has large amounts of dopamine. And when your oxygen level falls in blood, that cell starts to fire more. And it's actually very sensitive over quite a wide range. So the nerves are quiet when your PO2 is 500, which is extraordinary, but then, and perhaps suggests where we evolved what the oxygen concentration in the planet was. It was probably higher than 21%. But as it gets down, by the time it reaches about 50 millimeters of mercury, that nerve is almost maximally firing. So, and then it really, really ramps up after that. So once you're threshold at about 50, you start firing enormously. And that is transferred into the hypothalamus and the sympathetic nervous system. And all roads lead to Rome when you're stressed. So you get sympathetic nervous system outflow, you get tachycardia, bradycardia, you get stimulus to breathe, and you take very large, deep breaths. And you probably are very stressed. You'd have activation of the cortex and amygdala, and you'd start searching around looking for a place to breathe and a place to go. Your respiratory muscles would be maximally activated, and then you would increase your rate and depth of breathing. You'd be tachycardic and hypertensive. So they would be the sort of physiological responses to that hypoxemic syndrome. Over time, that dampens down, and you start to become, over a couple of minutes, a little bit desensitized to that hypoxemic stimuli, and some of that sympathetic nervous system racks back, and you probably become a little bit more tolerant. Assuming that you're not so hypoxic that you become unconscious, you start to tolerate that hypoxemia. And we see that in patients on the ward. They'll come in from home and their SATs will be in the low 90s or in the high 80s, and they'll feel very uncomfortable. And you might go back and see them the next day and their SATs will be 88, and they won't seem to be troubled by it because there's been a resetting of that sensory apparatus, which occurs quite quickly. And that's probably handy for those people that want to climb up a mountain, because otherwise they'd feel terribly hypoxic the whole time. Now, there's other adaptations that occur in terms of hyperventilation and CO2 and bicarbonate that occur as you acclimatise to altitude. But that acute sense of feeling hypoxic because you're breathing hypoxic air mixes is something that does actually dampen down over time. Then there are some longer term changes in response to that hypoxemia. The other area of the body that has O2 sensing apparatus is in the kidneys, in the peritubular capillaries, and that stimulates the kidneys to produce erythropoietin, and that goes to the bone marrow and promotes your red cell progenitors to produce red blood cells, and then you increase your red blood cell mass and you increase your oxygen carrying capacity. So curiously, the signaling apparatus is as a function of your partial pressure of oxygen, not your oxygen saturation or content, but the outcome of a low PO2 to the body is to stimulate to make more hemoglobin and more oxygen carrying capacity. So it's quite unusual. Now we don't actually know how the glomer cells senses that low oxygen. We think that it involves potassium channels and inhibition of potassium channels such that the cells start to depolarize because they waste potassium. There's very similar cellular mechanisms involving potassium channels at the oxygen or hypoxic sensing area in the alveolus, in the endothelium near the alveolus. So around the body, it seems to be that low oxygen levels impair potassium channel function and cause hypopolarization of your cell, and that in some way is transmitted as the hypoxic signal. But the initial stimulus is measured in the peripheral chemoreceptors. They then activate via Bruing's nerve or the vagus nerve into the brain, and then you get activation of the sympathetic nervous system, and you get all of the changes that the sympathetic nervous system would provide for you when you're stressed for any reason. So you can sort of list them off: tachycardia, hypertension, hyperventilation, agitation, sweatiness, and then you get that dampening response, and then you get the secondary changes.
Thanks, Mike. And I guess with the COVID-19 pandemic, it's quite obvious that we are seeing these more physiological effects in our patients. So often these patients are presenting with room air saturations around 85 or even sometimes in extremes, and they are tachypneic. And so the physiological effects, you don't need to, again, read in depth. You just observe the patients and you will know what happens with hypoxia. Maddie, do you have any questions for Mike? That's your chance to take some revenge, I guess.
Well, I thought I'd, finish with my usual trademark dad joke. Yeah,
no, this time. So Mike is going to answer your.
Man, you're quick to flick off the responsibility, aren't you? Fantastic. Now I know why. The only reason I'm here is to take this fire from Maddie. Okay, come on, Maddie, give it to me.
Okay. So why did the social climber have to be admitted to hospital?
Why did the social climber? I'm tempted to try and work out a way of why the social climber fell off something, but I'm struggling. I don't know. Why did the social climber have to?
I'm so happy to see you struggling, Mike.
Yes, a bottomless pit of ignorance. Don't you worry about that.
Okay. He had aspiration pneumonia.
Oh. Okay. All right. Very good.
Yeah. Good. Okay. That's 1-0 score, Mike. We'll keep.
Right. My turn next time, Maddie.
Okay. Okay. Bring it.
I'm so glad that you guys are back so that I am out of this whole thing. So thanks, Mike, and thanks, Maddie. We will continue with the similar format in next episode. For those folks who are preparing for fellowship along your journey, this is just a plug to our new venture. So Maddie and I have started a new podcast series called as ICU Fellowship PrepQuest. So please tell your colleagues and get them to subscribe on iTunes for this new podcast series. So once again, thanks, Mike, and thanks, Maddie. We'll be back in months' time. Till then, goodbye and have a nice time.
See you, Scott. Bye, Maddie. Thanks very much.
Bye. Thank you.